let's talk about sex. But like I said, it's been in my in my head the whole day, just humming it, singing it. So question, as we sit here having dinner, what do you think, free to anyone, what do you think the church has got right talking about sex and sexuality? And what do you think maybe the church has missed out on the discussion? We're going to cover it all tonight, so we're going to get it perfect. But hypothetically, what are some of the things that have been left on the table? What are some of the things where the church has really spoken to it well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like first thing that comes to my mind as far as what the church has done well is saying God has things to say about sex. And so when the church has talked about it, I think just the declaration that, hey, like, God has things to say about it and it matters. Yeah. It's not just up to me. I think that's something that the church has done well when we've talked about it. I think what we've done poorly is being behind on speaking to it, whether that's not speaking to it or halfway speaking to it. And I think like the thing that I think is a not fair portrayal or an accurate portrayal to a lot of people is we tend to tell even like sexual struggle testimonies as if I've arrived. Yeah. So it's like, I used to deal with this, now I'm all good. Right. Yeah. Versus the reality of like walking through all saying like, hey, we are in a process with this. And so I think people are uncomfortable being genuine about it and being honest. And I think that's a barrier for people where they think, well, I haven't arrived. So
I would add to that, I think the way we've approached even sexual brokenness with some behavior modification has potentially been harmful for me. It's been harmful for me to think that if I just do X, Y, Z, and then my sex life, my whatever will be better, right? And instead of embracing shame and being able to have a conversation about it, we try to just get an accountability, get in a group. Like that was kind of my experience, and it maybe stopped it for a second, but ultimately the sexual brokenness, like in my life, came back. And so, and that's the story I've heard from a lot of men is, modifying behavior doesn't actually work.
Right.
So,
That's good.
I think too, like the thing that I think that's going bad is really the whole thing around like vulnerability, but even to the point of like, what is it actually? Like, me being, 24, about to get married and things like that. Like no one's really talked about, what sex like why is it, for marriage and things like that, in an actual real way, in comparison to, just wait until.
That's the fault of the guy doing your premarital. That's the.
But why is it so hard for vulnerability to happen, do you think? Like,
I think honestly, like one of the things is just because, as a guy, I feel like a lot of men don't actually just naturally lean that way. Like you grow up and you're being told like, hey, be tough. Like don't cry. Like you're stronger than that. Don't let anybody see you weak. And even if some people's parents may not have necessarily said that, like that's what, in a sense, from the world's been expected of men. And I think that's a lot of the reason why,
Yeah.
I think the way that sex has been communicated, specifically to men and young men in the church, has just been so weird. Like, it's just and very confusing because I remember going to, like, our, where I grew up would host these, like, county-wide True Love Waits conferences and things like that. Right. And you would sit in one session and it would be them basically like, you're disgusting, you're not worth anything, can't even look at you, like that kind of, like men are terrible, we were made terrible, we were made to do and want terrible things, and you should feel shame about that. And that is, to me, it communicated that's the sin God cares about the most. Right. I was like, man, this thing that's like happening in my body and in my mind is bad, and I can't help it. And so, and then on the other end of the spectrum, it's like, none of it's your fault. This is the way God made men. Girls should wear different clothes. And like, no responsibility whatsoever. And so it left me in the middle with just kind of like a, what?
There's no nuance, right?
Yeah, no nuance at all. And it was very black and white, but also on two different sides of the spectrum. And so it left me like hating, but also like blaming other people for my sin.
Right.
And, obviously that's not healthy. That's not healthy for women to think that, they are being offensive by showing up into a room.
Right.
And, carrying that weight that the men around them, that they can cause them to sin into, like I said, like what is communicated as the worst sin.
Yeah.
And so it's just very weird, confusing.
Right.
Yeah. I feel as though like my experience has been like the same as John's. Like I feel like when I grew up, like say high school age, like I felt like I heard the church say, hey, we acknowledge sex as a thing.
Right.
We acknowledge that there are things in the Bible that talks about sex, right? Yeah. But I think on the other hand, where I felt like the church has had it wrong is the fact that like we've allowed culture to navigate and like narrate what sex is for our people. And when you learn sex from TV, when you learn sex from culture, like it just breeds death. And when you don't take the hand of culture and partner it with the gospel, like, and partner with biblical worldview, like, you just get people running rampant and confused. And I felt like I was, because I'm like, wait, like it's okay to do this, but you're telling me like, no, if you have sex, you will die. Like, and I'm like, what? No,
You'll get pregnant and die.
Right? Like, I mean, that's what you hear, and it's like that's not God at all. Like he created sex, and like he wants us to talk about it. He wants us to talk about our sexuality, like because he created sexuality, right? It all begins with the Creator. He spoke and it existed. So all the other things that he is, like, it's all embedded in who he is as a creator. And so, like, if he created sex, why not go to the person that, like, created the thing, right? And I feel like we didn't. We shied away from it. We made it taboo. We made it shameful. And therefore, this is why men are like ashamed to bring it up. It's because the church does not talk about it enough, and we've allowed culture to be the narrator for sex. And it also goes down to like parenting too, because it's like we have not given parents the tools to like educate our kids on what is actually out there and like what they're going to be receiving from the world. Because I mean, I heard about sex first grade.
Did everybody have the sex talk?
No.
I did with my mom.
That's amazing.
Yeah, my mom was dope.
Who else
Like,
didn't?
Wait, have a what?
Well,
Sex talk with your parents?
No.
yeah, I mean, I would say I did, but it was much too late.
Ooh.
And they were like shocked. How do you know that? How do you know what that is? I'm like, I've known for probably 2 or 3 years now.
Wow,
So I was like,
yes.
yeah, so for me, it's almost at that point, I would have rather have not had it. You know what I mean? Because it just felt like, man, this is, I know a lot about what you're saying, and this is way behind. And that's, I think part of what was challenging is like we grew up in an age where technology and communication was rapidly, so like access to understanding of sex was rapidly increasing for households.
For sure.
I just think that's hard for parents in general to realize like, hey, like I'm a father of a 1.5-year-old. It's hard for me to picture that one day, hey, like that's gonna be a conversation I need to have. And I could see the inclination to think, oh, he doesn't need that right now. But I think just being realistic of like, man, what's able to get to our kids and how early it's able to get to them, how quickly, like, I don't want to be behind on that conversation. It's challenging.
Because you know what you're not talking to Callum about, but you don't know what, when he gets into environments, other parents are talking or their kids are, like, you know what the boundaries of your home are, but you have no concept about theirs.
Yeah.
So
It's like the kid who, comes to school and he already knows that Santa Claus is fake.
Yes. And he tells everybody. We're like, why did you
I thought Santa Claus was real.
Were you that kid?
No, I wasn't that kid. My cousin was the kid who told me that Santa Claus was fake.
Yeah.
But it's more the kid who comes to school and he's already got porn on his phone. Right. That's the reality.
Right.
Yeah, my parents, like, I think the conversation was like, oh, you're going to go to this sex education class in 7th grade. And by that time, it was kind of too late. And so the conversation was like, there just wasn't one, right? It's like I was going to go to school, I was going to take the sex ed class, and that was going to be how they thought that they did their job and I'm going to understand this. So yeah, I think, equipping parents, like you said, like has got to be the role of the church moving forward in these conversations at an early age.
I was super thankful for my mom. I mean, she had to be both mom and dad at times because she was single. But she, sat us down when we had questions. She sat us down when I discovered porn, and I was like, I didn't know what that was, Mom.
That's amazing.
And she told me, like, hey, this is what it isn't. And this is what it is. The context of what sex is supposed to be about. And just sexuality in general. Like, I think that, like, beyond, let's get to it, beyond penetration, there is other things, right? And so, like, she taught me what a sexual being is like, what it's like to have, like, sex in the confines of marriage. And so I'm just super thankful for her having that conversation with me. Now, it didn't go like crazy deep, but it went deep enough to where like we can build upon that.
Sure.
And I had a foundation to where like when I knew I was looking at something wrong, I knew. And I had a quick conviction of what my eyes wasn't supposed to see.
Sure.
So.
That's something I was super encouraged about with my dad is when my dad had caught that I looked at porn, he took time to talk it through with me.
Wow, that's awesome.
And he even took that time to say like, hey, like you might experience masturbation and say like, hey, I've done that. Wow. Able to like name and like repent of that with me. Just really helped guard me from like a lot of shame.
Wow.
Yeah.
How old were you when that was happening?
It was probably like 6th grade, so yeah, whatever age that would be. Probably
10 or 11.
10, 11, yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, that was super helpful, I think, just to hear from a father, like, hey, I'm gonna speak to this and be vulnerable with you. Because I know that was hard for him and awkward.
Yeah.
But yet it meant the world to me and helped me understand, like, hey, like, I'm facing a challenge that my father walked through. So
That's massive as well, because what he didn't say is, you're the one doing this and I've never done this and I'm shocked and appalled at you.
Yeah.
Right, if you think about people watching this or whatever, probably just men, if you're thinking about, maybe you've got teenagers, children, you're thinking, okay, right, sex talk. 3 minutes into this video, got to figure out the sex talk. But you're still looking at porn, it's going to feel like, well, how am I meant to tell my son? How am I meant to tell, like, I'm doing this, you should stop doing it, I'll try and stop doing it too. But your dad met you in his own brokenness, right? I've done this. I've experienced this. And I think that some of the power for reclaiming a new vision of what male sexuality or even biblical male sexuality needs to look like is that I am continually being a sexual creature who's being healed and whole. As opposed to, before I was married, I did these bad sex things. Now I'm married, I try not to do these bad sex things. One day I will never do bad sex things. Like that, there has to be a better story to tell than that.
Right. Yeah, and part of my story was I tried to hate sin like enough to to defeat it, to beat it, right?
Yeah.
You know, obviously God's word says it's by the Spirit that we put to death the deeds of the body. And I think I kind of missed that part. But also, one thing that really helped me when I started to gain freedom in the area of sexual brokenness was learning that confessing and wanting to just not do the thing wasn't actually going to be freedom for me, right? Like the absence of a behavior isn't freedom. It's I got to be free towards something, and so I'm set free for freedom, right? I'm set free for freedom, and that really changed the game for me. That I was, you know, it wasn't that I just wanted to get rid of the sexual sin. I wanted to gain God in my life. I wanted to be set free for freedom. And that's when I began to experience a lot of healing in my story when that happened. I think a lot of guys don't, you know, understand that and know how to they just think that if I can just stop looking at porn, stop masturbating, that my life would be amazing. And it's like, no, that's not going to help. You've got to go beyond that. So
I'm thinking about like in Thessalonians, Paul says, he's celebrating how they turn from idols to worship God. So it's like, I think what you're saying so good is like, man, so much of the approach with sex is don't do it. So it's like, in that sense, it's like, don't worship idols. And you just leave it at that. Well, that's really hard. So, okay, well,
what do I worship?
They're here.
You gotta replace it with something.
Just that turning towards like, man, I'm leaving that for something better. Like there's something better for me than this sin.
Why do you think the relationship between sex and the relationship between our relationship with God go together so closely for men? Because when I think about it, like, I don't feel the same remorse about greed, pride, anger, other sins that would probably be actually more damaging to my soul potentially than I do sexual brokenness. Like it seems to have more of an effect. It seems to be able to get to a place of guilt, get to a place of shame, or reverse, the longer I feel freedom from in those things, the better I feel towards God, even though I might be doubly as angry as I was last year, but I'm not counting that in my wins and losses tally with God, right? Why do you think that is? Why do you think sex is so close and trends so close towards?
I would say it has to do with shame being the biggest role in a man's life has to do with their sex and sexuality and sexual brokenness. And that at that crossroads of shame is where God, like Jesus actually wants to meet us there, right? And it's not the place that he wants to be distant from. And in engaging in the shame is where I've found that like my story and being able to look at like, oh, why did I get here? When I began to study my shame and study my lust and study my sexual brokenness, it revealed this path for me of healing that was like, oh, this is why I feel this way, because I didn't feel cared for as a middle schooler, and so I ran to pornography, right? Or and so I just think that intersection of shame and sexuality, and I think I think sexual sin says, hey, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and of course Jesus says that too.
Right, that's a great point.
Right?
That's a great
and so
point.
I think that in that's the draw for us is like, oh, if I'm going to go to this thing because it's going to give me rest, it's going to give me peace. It obviously doesn't deliver on that, but it says the same thing that Jesus says.
Right.
So
I think it's has a lot to do with how the church defines masculinity, and then the fact that sexuality is so tied into masculinity in culture. And like, how do you reconcile that? Because, we live in a culture, specifically in the South, I would say most places though, where how you like to spend your time says something about your sexuality. And there's this picture of masculinity that, for me personally, the church has portrayed that would suggest that if I am not that, I must be gay.
Right.
Like, I don't like trucks and like axes. And, it's, I just want to like write my poems, but it,
Do it for the Lord.
but yeah, I think that is where it's been confusing for me. And just how deeply tied those three things are.
Yeah, that's true.
And it took a long time for me to figure out that none of that has to do with any of the rest of it.
Right.
What helped you make that jump?
I think, honestly, meeting men that were more like me and less like the people that I grew up around. And I remember going to college and being like, there are dudes that are writers and designers and artists, and like, how have they been this their whole life? Because I could not be this in my hometown, in my high school context. And so that, and then like spiritual leaders that pulled that out of me and, taught me truth in places that just straight up lies had been told.
It's wild, isn't it? Because like, what's poetry got to do with sex? Everything. Like, there's a quote, right, that everything's to do with sex except sex, which is to do with power. And it's like there's a reality that who we are, like you were saying, God created sex. So I think about, okay, God's created sex. God could have created any means for sex, but he created sex with the ability to give us great pleasure. He created sex with the ability to be incredibly fulfilling. He created us to have a capacity for sex that's pretty high, generally. And it's like, why did he do that? There must be some reason of connectivity with it, and there must be some reason why this is a point of attack for so many men. And it's like, what does liking trucks versus liking poetry have to do with sex? Like, somewhere in there, who you are as a man gets shaped, defined, and that inevitably gets expressed sexually. And it's like, man, we should be talking about this 100 times more because it's every area of life. What do we think, if you could have learnt, married guys, if you could have learnt one thing about sex before you came into marriage, what would it have been?
This is where my premarital coming
That's right, exactly right. Well, we're about to get a 2-for-1 session here. Just in time to get some like a very early gift.
That's a great question.
You don't have to go if you don't want them.
I can go real quick. I mean, one of the main things for me was I believe that marriage was going to solve my sexual brokenness, right? That it was going to be the answer to why I wanted to look at porn, why I wanted to masturbate, why I wanted to like engage in all these things. And it just didn't. Like, I actually brought my sexual brokenness into my marriage, and that was a place that we had to work it out, right? And so that's the one thing that I wish I would have like actually dealt with my sexual brokenness before marriage in a real way, instead of assuming, oh, well, once I get married, I'll have a a place to do that.
Right.
So
Yeah. That'll be the restraining order that I finally need.
Correct.
Right. A little bit.
correct.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure.
I think for me, going alongside of what you kind of just said, and then you as well, like, I wish I would have like truly known like that my sexual trauma was gonna affect my sex bed. Like that is the point of tension that my wife and I have. If anything in our marriage, if you want to like strip it back to the bare bones,
Right.
like I feel like we are good, and then the enemy is like, but your sex life. And just a part of my story, like I was sexually assaulted from the age of 5 to about 8 years old. And I went to counseling in college. I was like, and also what you said, John, like we have this mentality that like we dealt with it in the past and then now we have arrived.
Right.
I think that I went into marriage like, I'm good.
Right.
Like the Lord has dealt with my like same-sex attraction, like we're good there, like we're working through it. I told my wife about it. We're, working through that. I'm obviously attracted to my wife, like we're gonna be good. And then like fast forward, like literally 6 months into marriage, like we just had a really good come to Jesus moment of like, you have not dealt with your trauma. And that is affected, that's brought baggage into your marriage bed that I was ignorant to believe that I was okay.
Right.
And that's what I wish I would have liked.
Yeah.
How did you end up dealing with that trauma?
For sure.
Like, talk to us about that.
Between more counseling and being radically honest with my wife, that has created a foundation of intimacy. Now I still mess up and I still have this like shame battle in my head because am I still sexually attracted to men? Yes. And like, does that affect my marriage? Yes, but it doesn't have power if I let it into the light.
That's a great way
And
to
when
put it.
I was like, when I gave it power was when I was dealing with it alone because I'm like, my wife doesn't really know what it's like to have same-sex attraction. My wife doesn't really want to know those things. Like those things are gross, those things are shameful. And until I was like, hey babe, I need you to like see the good, bad, and the ugly in me, was when we grew that intimacy together. And like regain power against the enemy together. Because I went into my marriage fighting my same-sex attraction by myself. And I can honestly say to this day, like Alex is my partner in it and not just a observer of it. Because I want to give her my best self all the time. Of
course you do.
Right? And that's where I fail of unpacking that baggage with her. And like beyond the sex, it is incredible to be intimate with my wife in that way, to like show her my ugly and my bad. And therefore the good can be so much more enjoyable. Like our sex is way better when I'm like, I've had a terrible week of like where my eyes have been lingering. And like we get to talk, we get to pray together, we get to ask the Lord for grace and mercy, and we get to repent for the things that I've done and the things that I didn't know I even did, to allow my mind to get to a space where I was lusting. And then we have incredible sex. And so like, and then we have incredible intimacy. And so that's how like we've like attacked the enemy in that. I wouldn't say defeat, because like the enemy is still tempting, right? The thing is still tempting to me, but my wife and I have been able to fight better. Based on like what we learned in counseling and like me just being radically honest with her about it.
Yeah, that's so good, man. I just so appreciate like you sharing that. I think like, because I remember the first time I had a friend who, very similar journey to yours, he just shared me like, man, like my propensity to be attracted to men's not gone.
Yeah.
I just think that was such a healthy, like helpful understanding.
Yeah.
It really helped me a lot. And like, man, like my propensity to like lust after women who are not my wife, that's not gone. Like,
for sure.
That was the wrong subject. Right.
But it's about saying the thing behind the thing, right? Being able to get to that like bottom layer of like, not just saying like I might struggle, but like no, like this is the thing.
Naming it,
and it's so helpful.
Yeah, that's so good. I think Daniel, like I think probably similar journey in a sense of like, man, early on in my marriage, I'm like, man, this is the solution for. And then as like lust habits crept back up for me, it's like. I think I didn't realize, to go back to your question, Finn, about what's one thing we would have known. I think just realizing like, man, like my laziness and my propensity to lust are very closely tied. Wow. And so like great sex takes like work, like it takes pursuit. And sex as you know it before you're married, because I was on the very much like that. Don't have sex till I'm married. Didn't have sex till I'm married by the grace of God, physically.
Right.
But mentally that wasn't the case.
Right.
For sure.
And so all those habits I had of like my coping and like, oh, I struggled were, it was easy, it's quick, it's when I wanted it, at the moment.
Yep.
And then you get into the context of marriage and it involves pursuit and care and not just like, hey, I want this right now, let's gonna make it happen. And even just the nature of the way men are wired and women are wired, like, man, like, I mean, it's the classic microwave oven analogy, but it's so true. Like, it's like, man, I have to love and pursue, like, my having sex is for her. Like, we are doing this, like, towards each other. It's not something that serves me.
Right.
And I think my relation to sex was always self-serving. Always self-serving before I was married. So I think just I would have said like, yeah, it's not for me, it's for my wife. But realizing, man, I have so many habits ingrained in me in the way I relate to sex, the way I've related to sex for the first 27 years of my life, or since I had these desires was, it's for me.
Yeah.
It's to please me. And then like the rewiring is like, man, like, no, this is for my wife. And so I care about what she wants. I care about when she wants it. I care about how she wants to be pursued. And she really helped and said like, hey, like you pursuing me for sex starts in the morning. Like how you leave the house, like there's a pursuit there. So I think just understanding how my laziness would relate to that would be.
Yeah, that's good. Because I think even with sexual brokenness, like I've experienced this like self-soothing. Like that's what I used to kind of attribute. Like, okay, I just need to numb out. Like, it's like alcohol or any drug. It's like I just want to like stop feeling, and so I would run to sexual brokenness and pornography. But what I've also found is that like in indulging in that, I was affirming some lies that I had already believed about myself, right? So it wasn't just the self-soothing, that's one side of the coin, which is very valid, like that's what I was going to it for, but it also affirmed or confirmed the things that I believed about myself, that like, hey, I don't have purpose, or some of the lies that I've had to unravel in my life were confirmed in the actual action. It was like, yeah, you don't have purpose. Look at what you just did, right? You're purposelessness. And so I think being able to understand those two sides of the coin are really helpful for me in my sexual brokenness. So
The thing you're talking about is huge, because when you're looking at porn regularly, there is no pursuit. Women or men or whatever porn you're watching are objects, and they exist solely for the purpose of your climax, your orgasm. I'll finish when I'm finished, and then I turn you off. Right. And it's when you get married, you're suddenly faced with a real woman with real preferences, with her own mind about how this is going to go and her own sexual history, and you suddenly have to realize this isn't a screen with someone who I can find to do something for me. I actually have to listen and learn and love you, and then maybe, just maybe, this will end in sex, or maybe it won't, and I have to be okay with that because you don't exist for my pleasure. I think that's absolutely massive.
I feel like that, even in just hearing all that's the narrative that you don't really hear. Like as I think, even back to the first question that we asked, like where do you feel like the church has gone wrong? Like I don't think I've heard any man growing up have that conversation. You know, like whenever it comes to just the conversation of sex, it always feels like it's a little bit on the back end because maybe you're trying to like, protect innocence and things like that, which is a valid thing, but it always feels like catch up. Like it always feels like, oh, let me help you fix this problem, rather than like helping show what the reality of it is in the beginning. Because I think if you were to ask most young men today, like they wouldn't have said anything that y'all said.
Sex is the reward for purity. The moment you cross that finish line, get ready to have tons of it.
Yeah.
And we haven't even talked about the fact, like when it goes wrong or when you do something stupid.
Right.
You think, okay, this will absolutely work. Oh no, absolutely not. This becomes now a running joke, and you get in your own head about it, and all of that. No one talks about that.
Yeah. One of the things, if I could add on to that question that you just asked, that I would have like known before getting married, is just like you can have fun in your marriage bed. Like I think that like when we first got married, like it took us 3 days to get there, to be frank.
Sure.
And it was because Alex came from a background of like, you don't have sex and then all of a sudden I'm supposed to press play once I say I do.
No, yes.
Right, like it's like you've been told no. And now it's like, okay. And we didn't even kiss before we got married. Like we just withheld that because that's something that we were convicted about. And then like we had to kiss. And then the next day you have this pressure and I'm on the other side. Everybody's like, dog, you about to get some, da 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 da. Like, and I'm like, I don't know how this is supposed to be, but I don't think it's that. And so we get to our place, our honeymoon place, and it's like, all right, we're about to do this thing.
Yeah.
No, we're not. Because I need to like respect my wife and where she is, but she also needs to understand that like this thing is happening. Right. And so like we had to figure out like who we are sexually, like how we gonna do our thing, and like we had to understand like this is not. Don't take yourself too seriously. Right. I think that that's also something that people don't hear. Yeah. Like as you're like getting married, like I want you to like know that sex is enjoyable and it's freaking awesome. Yeah. But like know that like you have to be communicating with your partner. Right. You have to like get to know what your partner wants and all the things. Yeah. But like I think I didn't hear those things before I got married, and I'm like I wish that we didn't demonize sex as much as we do. Right.
Just to hone in on like I think just the being curious about especially your spouse, your partner's like their desires, what they like, what they don't like after sex thing. Like, did you enjoy that? What about that did you enjoy? Right. And being able to just ask good questions to them about like, hey, why did you feel shame in that moment? Oh, and then you get to talk about some past things that maybe had happened. And so just being curious about it can help move your sex life along, as a couple. So
and none of that's in porn, and none of that is in Hollywood, right? It's I want you, you want me, quick sex. Both of your minds are blown. You orgasm at the same time, and then you lie there for a moment and just think about what you're going to do next, brunch or whatever. And it's like. I'm just like that's completely inaccurate, and you're thinking like I think Hollywood's more to blame maybe than porn, because porn's like I know this is fake, but surely this isn't fake, and it's like no, it is too. This whole thing is a myth. It's made up, but it's like the questions, the communication. That's actually the intimacy that I feel like you're after. Is the naked and unashamed, both physically but more emotionally, spiritually. I see you, you see me. That could have been horrible, but we're closer because we didn't attack each other. We're closer because we laughed.
Yeah. Right? Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Like all of that is.
And learning from mistakes too. Like I remember like early in my marriage, I would like get on my phone after we had sex and like, but it was like, no, this is a time to engage and for us to cuddle and for us to like talk and like, I had to learn that. Like I had no idea.
That's good. Yeah. I think that taking it too serious. I think that's something culture communicates like. Because you think about what's like sexy, it's always this kind of like mysterious, like serious thing. And that really helped me. I think it's C.S. Lewis talks about how like we take ourselves too seriously in this in a sense. Like there's something that's really funny about what's happening. Like it's wonderful, but it's like I think just feeling okay to like, hey, they're like we can laugh in the marriage bed.
Yes.
I think it's very healthy.
Yes.
For
sure.
Okay, so how do we redeem married, single, nearly married, whatever? How do we redeem sex? How do we take that and say, okay, this is something God's got? We're kind of talking around that, but sometimes marriage changes the dynamic for some people. But I think there's a baseline of what sex as a disciple of Christ should look like. What would be some basics? What would be some things you'd say this applies to everyone in any season?
Right. I think the first thing I'll probably say is like, I mean, we were talking about a little bit earlier, but like what is it that God actually has to say about it? You know, what is that honest conversation, like even in the sense of, you know, more than just, oh yeah, wait till you're married because, you know, sex is better in marriage, but like, why?
Right, yeah.
Like, because on the surface level, like, I feel like quite honestly, like if I wasn't following Jesus, like, why would I wait? Right. It doesn't make any sense to wait at all, you know? Yeah. So that would be, you know, what I would say, like, just why? Like, why? Like, let's answer that question of, like, why?
Yeah.
I think hearing perspectives like what you guys had, like walking through something that I assume you felt like this is the reason she's going to leave me. When this comes out, like, it's going to hit the fan. Mm-hmm. And the fact that she walks in that with you, like, revolutionary idea to me.
Really?
Like, wow. I mean, like, just to think about that level, I mean, that is intimacy, you know? And that's really incredible. So I think hearing things like that and just, the reality of this is not great always. And this is, and I'm single and like in my late 20s. And so I've got to see this with my friends that it's like, a year in, it is not the text that I got after the wedding day, But just like being able to take that in, that's huge.
I think being able to, a basic for me would be understanding what God is asking. I think about, Genesis, like Adam and Eve sin, and God doesn't say like, why did you do this, right? He says, where are you, right? If you keep going, like you see with Hagar, like Hagar is feeling all this shame and goes out to the wilderness, and the angel of the Lord comes and says, where are you going? Like, where have you been? Like, that God is actually curious about us and wants to ask us questions and engage with us in that.
Right.
And I, had a wrong view of that very early on. It was like, God just wants to be hard on me and harsh on me about this. And so until I was able to lift my head and say, no, God just wants to know where I am. He wants to engage with me in this. I wasn't able to experience some healing and being able to move forward.
That's amazing.
That's great.
I love that. I think we gotta I want to take sex off the pedestal. I really do. Like I said, earlier, marriage is great and it's a form of glory because it's obviously the relationship that we're supposed to exemplify between Christ and the church, but it's not the glory, right? And so I think how the Bible says the created has worshiped the created thing. Right. We've done that, whether with sex, and we gotta take it off its
in
pedestal.
the church too.
In the church, but we cloaked it with marriage.
Right.
The idol.
And we really have, and we've mystified it and made it this hush hush thing. We don't talk about the stories. We don't talk about the real. We don't talk about the marriage bed. And I'm not saying that I'm out here preaching all the things about my sex life. No, I'm not going to do that. But I think that we need to educate our men and women, but specifically right here, we need to educate our men on what it's like for real, especially people that are looking forward towards marriage. We need to take down this marriage is the pinnacle, because then we're affecting our single people. We're telling them that that's not enough, and that the Lord's going to do something in you sexually, but you just wait until you get married, it'll get better.
Right.
No, you're still a sexual being and God cares about your sexuality.
That's right. That's right.
But how, right? And so we need to be willing to educate our people truly about sex and take it off the freaking pedestal, because it's just going to continue to perpetuate itself, and we're going to continue to mystify sin. We're going to continue to mystify sex and continue to be the end goal is marriage.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not.
Yeah.
It's Jesus.
Right.
I don't like what you said. You have to get back to Jesus. You have to point back to Jesus. And just side note, whenever I have mentees or people that tell me about they have same-sex attraction and they're confused in their sexuality, I'm not gonna give you 5 steps to how to be heterosexual. That's not the goal. You don't trade homosexuality for heterosexuality and that's holiness. No. You trade your sin for holiness, and that's going after Jesus. And so we just have to do that as a church.
Yeah, that's great. I think sex just being something that, understanding that it is not meant to primarily be self-fulfilling. Now it is, there is this sense in which, man, my desire is burned for my wife, that's a good thing, and I will be I'll be able to enjoy those desires with her. So I certainly, but when I realized, man, those desires are for her and not for myself. I think that's the biggest thing we tend to get misconcepted. I think unhelpful, something that is real is unhealthy sex doesn't just exist outside of marriage, but in marriage, there are some really unhealthy environments where a partner doesn't feel comfortable and they're being forced into having sex. And I think you have to realize, this is not it's not meant to glorify me. It's not meant to solely for me. It's not, my wife is not just for my satisfaction. I'm very satisfied in her. But it's kind of honestly, if you think about the way we relate to Jesus, it's Jesus is not just to make me feel great all the time. But I feel the best in Jesus. You know what I'm saying? When I'm following Jesus, it's the best thing ever. But his purpose is not to make me happy all the time.
That's right.
His purpose is to receive glory, which makes me happy. So I think it's just similar in marriage. Like when we realize, like, yes, like sex is wonderful and it is fun and at times it's not, and sometimes it's wonderful, but those desires are good, and it's good to have those like fulfilled in my spouse. That's not the end goal. Is that not I feel great. And that's so much of what sex is communicated. It's like, you're gonna feel great, and then a lot of times when guys talk to each other about sex, like, dude, sex is gonna be awesome. Like, you're gonna have sex, like, it's gonna be so great. Or like young men, like, oh, when we have sex, it's gonna be so wonderful. I think the reality is, like, man, like I get to share something with my wife, and that's what it's for. It's not for me feeling great.
And thinking about what you just said, Jesus, as far as we know, didn't have sex. Right. So there must be a way to be a whole human being, specifically a human man, that has nothing to do with sex. So there's this duality of who we are sexually, massive part of us.
Right.
And yet, Jesus seems to be able to does live the fullness of a male existence without sex. And I think even for couples that are struggling to connect intimately, when you have problems, when there's dry spells, all that sort of stuff, you have to run to the idea that who I am sexually is actually defined and formed by Jesus. It's not defined, A, by how little porn I'm watching, or B, how much sex I'm getting. It has to be bigger than that. So I just think that's what you're saying is so true and so huge, that there's an element of sex is another opportunity to be formed into the image of Christ. Who I am sexually, who I am in the bedroom is an opportunity for formation. Big formation guy, obviously. But like I just think that there's so many opportunities for us to reclaim and remodel and renew our minds around what does it mean to be a sexual man who's either having sex or not having sex, and yet isn't living with his sexuality running everything about him. Right? There has to be a bigger narrative than that. When it comes to sexual freedom, thinking about guys that are watching this, a couple of your encouragements, things that have helped you, things that have really changed the perspective. I know we've touched on a lot here, but if someone's watching this and they are just trapped, porn, affairs, same-sex attraction, sexual brokenness within the marriage, sex is being weaponized, it's being withheld, or it's being used as a punishment, any of those sorts of things, what would be your advice? As single guys, you can speak to this too, maybe first.
I think the thing that I would say, like, this obviously isn't the end-all, be-all, but this could also be like just the way that I think. But whenever I think about, things that have helped me actually, walk into and accept the freedom that Christ has on offer, is one, realizing that, like, I'm not controlled by it. Like, even though like it may have been going for a very long time, like there's still so much hope. But for two, something that actually did really help me was like changing something. Like, I feel like a lot of times, it's kind of just like, oh man, I want to grow in this area, but you don't want to like change some aspect of your life to help you actually get closer to Christ. So I mean, quite frankly, for me, one of the big things was like, I found that, for me, whenever like sexual temptation comes, it's more at night. So like a easy practical thing for me was like, all right, let's just stop charging my phone by my bed. And like, that wasn't the end all be all.
That's not religion, that's wisdom.
Yeah. It's not the end all be all. It's not like, oh yeah, you there's something you have to do, but it's something that like actually helped me, set myself up well for going after the holiness in Christ. So I would say, change something, do something different that actually, represents what you want to go for.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And letting others in on those changes. And letting them see areas that you don't have as much self-awareness in. So I think we all could say, like, phone in the room, not great, probably shouldn't.
Right.
But, there's so many other opportunities in this day and age. And, it seems like the Sunday school answer, but accountability and real accountability that's actually like worth something, and not just sitting around the table. And you were kind of saying this before, like, looked at porn. Everybody, okay.
We all looked at porn?
We all did it.
Great, let's try not to do it again. As long as you all keep doing it, I'm going to keep doing it.
And it's, yeah, so much of it is like more enabling than it even is accountability.
Yeah.
And I forget who said this. I want to say it was Meredith Knox. She was talking about accountability and how like that word means to give an account of your ability.
Yeah. Right.
And for ability to look more like, hey, this is what is possible for you through the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is in you. And this is what is on offer for you. And it coming from a place of calling you higher instead of shame and, feeling worse about yourself or feeling validated that everyone else is doing it.
Right.
It's been big.
I would say, just a little bit of my story, like my sexual brokenness in my marriage. Like I was hiding, looking at pornography, and it all goes to destruction, right? Like you don't just get into pornography and then it ends there. Like these things, it wants to take you further and further and further. Right. And so for me, it took me into seeking out actual like relationships online and trying to have these encounters and trying to satisfy this thing. And so I had all this like, oh man, I can't share this with anybody. Right. And so I would just tell somebody, that God's kindness is what leads us to repentance, right? Yeah. And so if you're watching this and you have some addiction going on and you have some unwanted sexual brokenness, like it's the kindness of God that I think will draw you out of that. Yeah. And also like you don't have to be better tomorrow, right? Like the goal isn't that tomorrow or next week you're all of a sudden 100% free and you're doing great, right? But it's I would just encourage you to be curious about why you're there, why you find yourself in the brokenness that you're in, and be willing to talk to people about it, talk to God about it, being able to ask those questions and be curious about your story, because I think when you can get a hold of your story, because I was able to look in and obviously like my wife and I went to counseling and there was a lot of steps we had to take, but at the end of the day I was able to look back and say, oh, I've been insecure about myself, and so that's why I chased after this. And so a lot of my sexual brokenness didn't have to do with the sexual stuff at all. Right. It was actually insecurities. It was actually me thinking that my value was only in how I looked or in how I could, what people thought of me, right? And that's what led me to these things. And so just be curious about your story, and be curious about your family origin, right? Because lots of trauma and things like that can be there that God wants to talk to you about and other people want to talk to you about. So,
I feel like a big thing is, I think with accountability, I think we grow weary in confessing as we're walking through it. And I think accountability groups grow weary of someone having the same thing. I think both those are really important not to be the case. Yeah. So it's like, we've been in those accountability groups before, like porn becomes a thing. And so Daniel shares that he's struggling with porn. So then the accountability group comes together. How you doing? Good on lust, man. Good on lust. Daniel, how you doing? I struggled again this week. Come on, Daniel. Come on, man. And it's like 3 weeks in, it's like this thing that someone just brought forward, like, hey, this has been an addiction for my entire adult life. And you're tired of them telling you 3 times that they're still struggling with it. I just think there's a reality of like, man, we are inviting people into the process and journey around it. And it's like, man, I'm going to be walking, and the reality is, and we've said this several times, there's going to be a sense where, I'm always going to be tempted towards that.
Right, for sure.
And so I think just that awareness. I also feel like so much of, growing in spiritual maturity is understanding, I grew up in, a Pentecostal setting where it's go down for an altar call and it gets broken. It's the way the wording was. Go down for an altar call, it gets broken. I receive it. And I think the unhelpful part with that is I don't think it's just that our desire for sin gets broken. I think we become self-aware. Like Paul's saying, hey, Christ saved to save sinners, of which I'm the foremost. I know what's in here better than anybody. Yeah. Right. So I think it's that awareness, and then I'm not putting myself in situations that I know I can't handle. Yeah. Right. And so I've heard it said, I don't want to be in front of a computer just with free access, being should I look at porn? If that's a struggle, I want to have way upstream, not even allowed myself to get into that situation. Sure. I think it's wisdom. It's not salvation, but it's man, if I can put myself in few situations as possible to sin, and starting here,
Yes.
then I've really helped set myself up for a win. But that was probably like when we're talking about what the church did right, I was thinking, I had a pastor who's, I just looked at him as like, man, he's one of the godliest guys I've ever been around, just super high character. I remember him saying like, I don't get on media with my wife's not present because I know myself. Right. So his confession was like, man, I know me and I know how I'm prone, so that's why I don't do that. And he wasn't saying like, hey, you shouldn't do that.
For sure.
But it was just a helpful like, okay, so you're like that aware of your propensity to sin that you take it that seriously. And I look at you like, have you sinned? You know what I mean? So it's, I just think that self-awareness and not putting ourselves in situations of like, man, if I just keep putting myself in the situation, but I get it broken off me, then I can put myself in that situation, I'm good to go.
I was going to say something along those lines, and then you said he was one of the godliest men I know, and I'm like, oh, I can't say that now. But one of the things where I've noticed a shift, even in our friendship, has not been the kind of confession of, oh, this is what I did, but the proactive, hey, Kate's going away next weekend. Hey, Danny's away for tonight. And it's like, I know if I don't want to tell you that Danny's going away, I'm already setting the path for my excuses. I'm already readying myself for, well, I can just confess to Daniel. Whereas I could have actually gone ahead and said, I'm going to tell you Danny's away, and you're going to text me tomorrow morning, and because I know myself. Not because I think I'm actually freer than I am necessarily. It's because I want to stay this way. I want to stay this thing. So guys, this has been so helpful. The food, the company.
Wonderful.
There's men who are watching this that are going to hopefully have their mind renewed. And I know that you guys as pastors and part of this church don't mind anyone just getting in touch with you, social media, reaching out, wanting to encourage, all of that sort of stuff. So thanks for this time. It's been amazing.